Dame i gospoda, dobry din. It is a privilege and a pleasure for me to be able to record this message for Digital St. Petersburg, the International Legal Forum. And my greetings to all friends, and in particular my respects and greetings to the Deputy Chair of the Security Council of Russia, Mr. Dmitry Medvedev. Ladies and gentlemen, the last decade has seen unprecedented growth in the use of intellectual property, and this has been driven largely by innovation and the emphasis placed on innovation by governments throughout the world and by the commercial sector. It's been driven also by the great innovations that have taken place in the course of the digital transformation that economies around the world, and indeed the world economy, is undergoing. We see that in terms of patent applications in the fields of digital communications, 5G, artificial intelligence, for example. Now that, of course, was the world that was, the world before the COVID-19 crisis. And it was characterized not only by growth in the demand and use of intellectual property, but also by an intensification of competition with the arrival of multipolar innovation. We've seen the rise of Asia as a major source of innovation and of intellectual property in the world. And in particular, the rise of China within Asia. It's also was a world that was characterized by increasing complexity in the field of intellectual property. Many searching questions have been raised. Intellectual property itself was in many respects a creature of the Industrial Revolution, and now through the digital transformation and the digital revolution, what role will it play, and how will that the institution of intellectual property adapt itself? We see this, for example, in the field of artificial intelligence, the questions that are being raised. By the way, we notice widespread use of the intellectual property system, the patent system in particular, for artificial intelligence applications. But there is a new dimension, a largely new territory for law in respect of data, where we see many different policy questions, not the least of them the ownership or property question arising in respect of data. And we've seen extraordinary innovations and developments in the field of the life sciences also, which have raised many questions for intellectual property. Now that, as I said, was the world that was in the past decade prior to the COVID-19 crisis. What may we expect now as a consequence of the pandemic? Well, it is very early stage, and so allow me to give you 5 or 6 thoughts on possible directions, possible impacts, but I would emphasize that these are highly speculative because we are still at a very early stage, I think, in the evolution of the pandemic. First of all, let me acknowledge the human tragedy associated with the pandemic and the primacy of health and safety in all of our policy considerations. But I think we must also acknowledge the great economic disruption that is being caused as a necessary side effect as a consequence of the measures being taken by governments around the world to contain the virus and to stop its proliferation. We don't know at this stage how deep the economic recession caused will be and for how long it will last. So to some extent, any remarks are speculative. But I would say that as a general comment, we are likely to find more emphasis on technology rather than less emphasis on technology as a consequence of the crisis, because we find ourselves in a situation in which there are technological gaps. We are yet to find a vaccination for the virus. There are gaps in certain medical supplies around the world and medical equipment. So I think we will see a greater emphasis rather than a reduced emphasis on innovation and on intellectual property as a consequence. However, the nature may change in certain respects. For example, we will see, I think, less emphasis on physical global value chains as a consequence of the disruption, and perhaps more emphasis on virtual global value chains. Collaboration between scientists and technologists, between research and development sectors and institutions around the world, more in terms of global value chains than the global value chains that we have seen in the course of the last 20 years, which have been largely based on the physical production of goods in the economy. We will no doubt see that demand for intellectual property rights, which has expanded significantly in the course of the past decade, will suffer, at least in the short term, and we hope that it is very much the short term, but this will certainly be a consequence. I would like to think that governments will pay attention in the relief packages that they put together for the economy to the funding needs of innovation, and indeed, particularly for St. Petersburg, that great centre of culture, for the cultural centre, because startups are suffering from the liquidity crisis in the innovation sector. All of those persons in the gig economy, as they say, actors, performers, musicians, composers, writers, are suffering in the current circumstances. So their funding needs need attention in the context of the recovery packages that are being developed by governments throughout the world. We may see that collaboration changes in nature around the world. I've mentioned the movement from physical to virtual global value chains, but I think we are seeing a lot of collaboration in terms of the development of a vaccination for COVID-19, and that, I think, will call into question the line between science and technology and between openness and closure. And that is another, I think, development that we may expect. There will be much discussion about access to essential medicines as a consequence of this crisis. Now, let me say here, first of all, that the international legal framework and national legal frameworks recognize that in times of emergency, there are policy instruments available which disrupt the normal incentive structure of the innovation and IP system. Such instruments as compulsory licenses. They have been used and they will be used in the current crisis, and governments will not shy away from taking advantage of all of the flexibilities that are available to them to deal with the human suffering and misery that is being caused by the pandemic. However, that said, that option is available. That said, there is no evidence at this stage, and I would underline at this stage, there is no evidence that intellectual property is a barrier in the current circumstances. It is rather a lack of relevant manufacturing capacity that is proving to be a difficulty at the moment. The lack of, the lack of manufacturing capacity for equipment, ventilators, masks, sterilizing liquids, and so forth. This, more than intellectual property, it's a basic question of manufacturing capacity, and relevant manufacturing capacity is a barrier. Also, the measures put in place, the policy measures to limit the movement of persons and goods, constitute another barrier to the movement of medical supplies and equipment around the world. But again, we are not speaking of intellectual property as the barrier. We may see, as a consequence of the recognition of those barriers that exist, a movement towards responsible innovation. Now, responsible innovation is a concept that was discussed, has been discussed over several years now, and we may see that governments encourage responsible innovation in order to fill the gaps. And I think that we will see also a lot of innovation in the area of cyber protection, since the world is at least temporarily moving to a virtual existence. And cyber security will become a more important issue. Lastly, let me come back to St. Petersburg as the great cultural centre and say that let us not forget that one of the casualties in the economic side of this pandemic are the performers, the artists, and all those participants in the cultural sector. And I do hope that measures will be taken in recovery packages to ensure the survival of these persons who so enrich our lives. I wish you a very successful conference. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I have been in the past in the great city of St. Petersburg. Thank you very much.